He accused her of cheating and threw her out. 3 years later, he saw her holding a little boy who looked exactly like him. The skyline of New York shimmered through the penthouse windows as Andrew Winston stepped inside his home, loosening his tie with one hand while balancing his briefcase in the other. It had been another relentless day, back-to-back meetings, negotiations, and a last-minute investor call that had nearly derailed his schedule. His success had never been accidental. Every inch of his billion-dollar empire was carved through precision, sacrifice, and discipline. But tonight, something was off. As he stepped into the living room, he noticed the stillness. No music, no footsteps, not even the familiar hum of the city leaking in from the balcony. Only silence. Alice stood near the hallway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Her light brown hair was pulled into a loose knot, and her eyes, usually warm, were now guarded. She didn't greet him. Instead, her gaze followed him as he set down his things and looked up, confused by her frozen stance. Then he said it. Words sharp, sudden, and irreversible. "You cheated on me." Alice blinked, stunned for a moment, and then exhaled slowly, as if she had been bracing for this. "Andrew," she said softly, "I didn't." But he had already made up his mind. The rage had been simmering for days. He had seen a message, just one, that he misread, misinterpreted, and never asked her about. His pride had already written the story, and he didn't want edits. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "I saw what I needed to see. You don't have to say another word." She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "You didn't even ask. You just decided." "I don't need your explanations," he replied coldly. "I want you gone." She paused, her throat tightening, but said nothing more. There were so many things she could have said, so many truths she could have thrown back at him, but she didn't. Instead, she walked into their bedroom, packed a small bag, and returned minutes later with her coat on. She stood in front of him, her eyes full of something more painful than anger, disbelief. "I loved you," she whispered. "I still do. But you don't trust me, and that's not something I can fight anymore." And then, without another word, she left. The door closed behind her with a soft finality. Andrew stood alone in the vast silence of the penthouse, his heartbeat thudding beneath the expensive fabric of his shirt. He didn't move. He didn't call after her. He didn't even sit down. His whole life had been built on never looking back, and tonight, he convinced himself he was doing the same. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Alice was already carrying the weight of a life he would one day regret walking away from. A small heartbeat had started inside her only weeks before. But now, she was gone. And so was everything he thought he understood about love, loyalty, and truth. 3 years passed, and Andrew Winston never once spoke her name again. In the whirlwind of mergers, board meetings, and cross-continental flights, he buried the memory of Alice beneath polished reports and strategic victories. The penthouse remained pristine, untouched by any personal detail, no photos, no mementos, no reminders of what had once lived there with him. He told himself he had made the right decision, that betrayal didn't deserve reflection. And yet, sometimes, late at night when the city grew quiet and even the lights of Manhattan dimmed behind the glass, he felt something he couldn't name. A hollow echo in a home built for two. It was early spring in New York, crisp air lingering with the scent of rain, when Andrew's world shifted without warning. He had just stepped out of a black car in front of a midtown hotel, preparing for a private fundraising dinner. His assistant trailed behind him with a clipboard and phone, rattling off the list of guests and updates, but he barely listened. His attention was drawn instead to a woman standing across the street, near the curb, her arms stretched upward as she tried to hail a taxi. The sight struck him like a physical blow. It was her. Alice. Her hair was longer now, still light brown, tied in a loose braid that rested on her shoulder. She wore a simple coat and held a small child on her hip, a boy, no older than 3, bundled in a blue sweater and jeans, with dark hair and unmistakably blue eyes. His eyes. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. He couldn't. The chaos of the street faded, and all he could hear was the sound of blood rushing in his ears. The child turned slightly, looking around curiously, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met, those same eyes Andrew saw in the mirror every morning. It was impossible. No, it wasn't. It was real, and he knew it with terrifying clarity. The taxi pulled up. Alice adjusted the child on her arm and opened the door. She hadn't seen him yet. Andrew took a step forward, instinct rising in his chest, but stopped himself. What would he say? What could he say? As she turned her head, their eyes locked. The noise of the city fell away. She froze for half a second, the boy's head resting against her shoulder, then looked away. Not coldly. Not angrily. Just, deliberately. Like someone who had made peace with being unseen. She stepped into the taxi, pulled the door closed, and a moment later, the cab disappeared into traffic. Andrew stood motionless, not noticing the confused glance from his assistant, not hearing the phone still ringing. He had seen his son. A son he never knew existed. A child with his eyes, his features, his blood. And Alice, the woman he had cast out of his life without a single question, had been living with that truth every day. The dinner went on without him. He cancelled all appointments that night and returned home in silence, hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a drink and stared at the skyline that had once made him feel powerful. Now it meant nothing. He had built an empire on control. But that moment on the street had shattered it. Because the truth, the one thing he never asked for, had found him anyway. And it was just 3 feet tall, with blue eyes and a quiet gaze that had already begun to haunt him. The following morning, Andrew sat in his office, but for the first time in years, the numbers in front of him meant nothing. Spreadsheets, charts, and emails blurred together into a white noise that he couldn't decipher. His mind kept circling back to one thing, the boy. The child he had seen in Alice's arms. His son. Every time he blinked, he saw the same blue eyes staring back at him, eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly, it had shaken him to his core. The realization settled heavily over him, pressing against his ribs like a weight he hadn't prepared to carry. He had a son. And he had never been told. He didn't call Alice right away. Part of him feared she wouldn't pick up. The other part didn't trust himself to say the right thing. What was the right thing after 3 years of silence and absence? After accusations that had driven her away? He had been so sure of himself, so convinced she had betrayed him, that he never once gave her the chance to speak. That certainty now felt like the most dangerous kind of blindness. By evening, he found himself standing outside her apartment building. He had hired someone to find her, not out of malice, but out of desperation. It wasn't hard. She hadn't left the city. She hadn't even left Manhattan. While he had been closing deals in Tokyo and Berlin, she had been raising a child just blocks away. He stood by the curb, watching the entrance, unsure of whether to knock or just leave. But before he could decide, the door opened. Alice stepped outside with a grocery bag in one arm and her son holding onto the other. The boy walked unsteadily but confidently, talking about something in a tiny, excited voice that Andrew couldn't quite hear from across the street. Alice bent down, smiling at something he said, brushing a loose strand of hair from his face, and Andrew couldn't move. There was something breathtaking in how simple it looked. A life he had missed. A life she had built. Without thinking, he crossed the street. Alice looked up as he approached. Her expression shifted the moment she recognized him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in guarded surprise. She stood upright, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder as Andrew came to a stop just a few feet away. "Hi," he said, his voice unsteady. She didn't reply at first. She looked him over, then looked down at her son. The boy clung to her leg now, curious but cautious. "I saw you yesterday," he continued, struggling to find words that didn't feel like excuses. "I didn't know, Alice. I didn't know he existed." Her face remained still, her voice calm. "You never asked." There it was. The truth, laid bare. Not bitter. Not cruel. Just honest. And it hit harder than any accusation could have. She had carried the burden of silence for 3 years while he had lived in ignorance, protected by his own certainty. "I want to meet him," Andrew said. "I want to know him." Alice hesitated, then crouched down beside her son. "Ollie," she said gently, "this is Andrew. He's someone I used to know." Ollie looked up, wide-eyed, then nodded solemnly before hiding behind her coat. Andrew didn't push. He didn't kneel or reach out. He simply waited, letting the boy's comfort lead. Alice rose again. "I don't know what you're expecting," she said. "But this isn't something you can walk into like it's a deal you forgot to sign. He's not a project. He's a person." "I know," Andrew said softly. "And I'm not here for control. I'm here because I want to earn a place. If you'll let me." Alice studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once. "You can come by tomorrow. 5 o'clock. He likes books and dinosaurs. Don't be late." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and led her son down the block, disappearing into the city's blur of motion. Andrew stood there long after they were gone, replaying every second, every word. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing a deal, a headline, or a win. He was chasing something real. Something he had once thrown away. And now, it was time to see if it could ever be rebuilt. Andrew arrived 10 minutes early the next evening, standing outside Alice's apartment with a small paper bag in one hand and nerves settling like stones in his chest. He had no idea what a 3-year-old liked beyond the brief mention of books and dinosaurs. Inside the bag were 2 carefully chosen picture books, one about a triceratops and another with flaps that revealed animals hiding in the forest. He had never bought a toy before. He had never read a bedtime story. The weight of everything he had missed pressed heavily on him as he stood in the hallway staring at her door. When it opened, it surprised him how normal everything looked. The apartment was modest and warm, filled with soft light and the smell of pasta and garlic. Alice wore jeans and a sweater, her hair down this time, and though her eyes were still cautious, her voice was steady. "Ollie's just finishing his snack," she said. "You can come in." He stepped inside slowly, taking in the space. There were scattered toys in one corner, a row of tiny shoes by the door, and a worn but clean couch with a blanket draped over the side. It was a home that had clearly grown around a child. And somehow, it made him feel both deeply welcome and completely out of place. Then he saw him. Oliver was sitting at the kitchen table, his feet swinging beneath the chair, holding a small cup of juice with both hands. When he looked up and saw Andrew, he paused, not afraid, just uncertain. Andrew crouched down a little to be on his level and gently held out the bag. "Hi, Oliver," he said. "I brought you something. Books. Your mom said you like dinosaurs." Oliver didn't take the bag right away, but his curiosity flickered. After a glance at Alice, who gave the slightest nod, he got down from the chair, walked over, and accepted it. He pulled out the first book and flipped through it, mumbling softly, "That's a stegosaurus," before walking back to the couch and sitting with it on his lap. Andrew didn't follow him. He sat on a nearby chair, watching, unsure what came next. Alice came into the room, sat across from him, and handed him a glass of water. "He'll probably ask you a million questions once he gets used to you," she said. "He does that with people he likes." Andrew smiled faintly. "That would be an improvement. Right now, I think he sees me as some guy who brought paper." Alice's expression softened just enough to make the room feel less tense. He's cautious. Like me. There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, just thick with history. Then Alice looked at him and asked the question he'd expected but dreaded. Why did you believe I cheated on you? He met her eyes, the apology already written across his face. Because I was afraid. Because I saw something I didn't understand, and instead of asking, I reacted. I chose anger over trust. I thought I was protecting myself, but I destroyed everything instead. She nodded slowly. You didn't just destroy me, Andrew. You left him without a father. You don't get to pretend that didn't happen. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. Not to erase the past. Just to be part of his future. They both looked over at Oliver, who was now reading aloud to himself in a small, confident voice, mispronouncing words but too focused to care. Alice rose and walked over to him, adjusting the collar of his shirt and kissing the top of his head. We read 3 books before bed, she said over her shoulder. If you want to stay, that's one of the rules. Andrew stood up, heart pounding, and nodded. I'd like that. They sat together on the couch, with Oliver nestled between them, his tiny voice narrating a world filled with dinosaur adventures and hidden owls behind tree flaps. And for the first time in years, Andrew didn't feel powerful or accomplished. He felt small, humbled, and deeply grateful to be allowed into that space. When it was time for bed, Oliver reached out without thinking and let Andrew help him down. It was a small gesture. But to Andrew, it was everything. Before he left, Alice stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him closely. Same time next week? He nodded. Or sooner, if you'll let me. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, she said, we'll see. The door closed gently behind him, and Andrew stood in the hallway for a long time, holding on to the quiet sound of his son's voice still echoing in his head. He hadn't earned forgiveness. Not yet. But for the first time, he felt like he might be starting to deserve a place in the story. Over the next few weeks, Andrew returned to Alice's apartment regularly, always on time, never empty-handed, but never trying to impress. He brought puzzles, coloring books, and once a small plush dinosaur that Oliver insisted on taking to bed that very night. Each visit began with hesitation and ended with something warmer. Oliver, once quiet and wary, now waited by the window when it got close to 5 o'clock, asking his mother every few minutes, is he coming today? The shift was slow, but it was real, and Andrew felt it in the way the boy started to pull his hand without fear or lean against his side during stories. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, just the quiet accumulation of trust, one evening at a time. Andrew also began to stay a little longer. He would help clean up after dinner, listen to Oliver's retellings of his day at preschool, and sometimes, when Alice allowed it, put him to bed. At first, he stumbled through bedtime routines, unsure of where the pajamas were kept or which story Oliver preferred. But Alice was patient, watching from the doorway, and gradually stepped back, letting Andrew figure it out. And he did. He memorized the rhythm of Oliver's routines, learned which corner of the blanket to tuck first and which lullaby to hum softly as the boy drifted off. One night, after putting Oliver to sleep, Andrew walked into the kitchen where Alice was making tea. She handed him a cup without asking and leaned against the counter, arms crossed but not defensive. He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, I want to be his legal father. I want to be on his birth certificate. Alice didn't respond immediately. She stared at the floor, processing, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. You weren't there when he was born. Or when he got sick that winter and I was alone at the ER, terrified. Or when he said his first word. I did all of it by myself, and not because I wanted to. I didn't have a choice. I know, Andrew said. And nothing I do now will change that. But I'm here. I'm not walking away this time. Alice looked up, her expression more tired than angry. It's not just about showing up now. It's about staying when it's inconvenient. When he's older and asks hard questions. When he wants to know why you weren't there. I'll answer every one, Andrew said. Honestly. And I'll never let him believe he wasn't wanted. Even if I didn't know about him, I want him now, with everything I have. She nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. We'll need a lawyer. There's paperwork. A court hearing. I've already made the appointment, he said. I just need your consent. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air between them filled with a strange mix of grief and progress. Then Alice did something unexpected. She reached for a folder sitting on the counter and handed it to him. I kept his original documents. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped you'd ask someday. Andrew took it with trembling hands. Inside were hospital records, immunization forms, and a tiny footprint pressed into a birth certificate that read, Mother, Alice Taylor, and under, Father, a blank space. I don't deserve to be in this, he said quietly. Alice met his eyes. Then earn it. 2 weeks later, they stood side by side in a family courtroom. Oliver sat with a social worker coloring quietly, unaware of the significance of the moment. When the judge asked Alice to confirm that she wanted to add Andrew to the birth certificate, she didn't hesitate. I do, she said. Because he's not the same man who sent me away. When the judge turned to Andrew, he cleared his throat before speaking. I failed once, he said. But I won't fail again. I want to be his father in every sense. Not because the law says I can. Because I love him. And I'll prove that every day I'm given the chance. The judge signed the papers. It wasn't dramatic. No one clapped. But Andrew felt the gravity of that signature like a vow. He didn't walk out of the courthouse feeling victorious. He walked out feeling humbled, overwhelmed by how much he had to make up for, and how much more he was willing to give. That night, Oliver crawled into his lap with the birth certificate in his hands and said, Mommy said you're my dad now. Andrew smiled, holding him closer. I always was, buddy. We just needed the paper to catch up. Summer arrived softly, with long evenings and sunlit mornings that felt like a second chance. By now, Andrew had become a part of Oliver's daily life, no longer a visitor, but a presence. He picked him up from preschool twice a week, learned which snacks he liked best, and could recite entire pages of Oliver's favorite bedtime books without looking. It was no longer strange for the boy to reach for his hand or call out, Daddy, in public. Each time he heard it, Andrew felt something quiet and aching press into his chest. He had missed the first years of his son's life, but now he was building something real, something they both could stand on. Alice remained cautious, but not distant. Their conversations grew longer, lighter, though still lined with unspoken boundaries neither of them dared cross. They coordinated schedules, shared small parenting victories, and began to build a rhythm that felt more like family than formality. Sometimes, when Oliver had a cold or refused to sleep, they navigated it together, side by side, as if the years between them hadn't cracked everything open. On one such night, when Oliver woke crying from a nightmare, Andrew had been the one to soothe him. He held him close, whispering calm until the boy's breath evened, and when he looked up, he found Alice standing quietly in the doorway. She said nothing, but her eyes softened in a way he hadn't seen in years. That night, she didn't send him home right away. Instead, they both sat in the living room, talking quietly while Oliver slept, their voices low, not because they had to whisper, but because something about the moment didn't allow for noise. Despite the peace, something still lingered beneath the surface, unfinished, unsettled. Andrew knew it wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about what had been lost between him and Alice. One evening, as they packed away art supplies after a messy craft session, Andrew asked quietly, "Did you ever think of telling me? After you left?" Alice didn't answer right away. She wiped a streak of dried glue off the table, then looked at him. "I thought about it every day for a while," she said. "But I told myself if you wanted to know the truth, you would have asked before accusing me." I had to protect myself. And him. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I didn't just fail you. I failed him, before I even knew he existed. She sighed, her voice gentler now. You're here. You show up. That counts for something. But trust, it takes time. The next weekend, Alice invited Andrew to join them on a short trip to the coast. Nothing elaborate, just a 2-day stay at a quiet beach town, the kind with ice cream stands and soft sand that clung to your skin. Andrew hesitated at first, unsure if it was a test or something more. But when Oliver overheard and shouted, "Beach with Daddy," it felt like a decision had already been made. They drove down in separate cars but arrived together. The motel was small but clean, and the ocean was just steps away. Oliver ran wild, laughing and splashing in the shallow water, pulling both of them along in his joy. They built sandcastles, collected shells, and roasted marshmallows over a small fire pit. For the first time, the three of them moved together not like broken pieces trying to fit, but like something whole. But the second day brought an unexpected scare. In the late afternoon, while Andrew and Alice were distracted folding towels, Oliver wandered too far down the shoreline chasing a crab. When they realized he was gone, a sickening panic rose in Andrew's chest. They split up, shouting his name, their voices strained with fear. After 10 terrifying minutes, Andrew spotted him in the distance, sitting calmly on a rock, watching the waves. He ran to him, dropped to his knees, and pulled him into his arms, holding him so tightly that the boy squirmed and asked, "Daddy, why are you crying?" Alice found them moments later and froze at the sight, Andrew on his knees in the sand, tears on his cheeks, Oliver safe in his arms. She knelt beside them, her hands on both of their backs, and they stayed like that for a long time, not speaking. The fear had shaken something loose, some wall that had stood between them since the day she walked out of his life. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, Andrew sat outside on the small balcony of their motel room. Alice joined him without speaking, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The night air was cool and smelled of salt and firewood. He looked over at her, eyes tired but open. "I don't think I've ever been more afraid than I was today." Alice nodded slowly. "Neither have I. I don't ever want to feel that way again," he said. "Then don't disappear," she replied. "From him. From this." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not again." She didn't answer. She just looked out toward the waves and, after a moment, leaned her shoulder slightly against his. Not fully. Not finally. But it was enough. And for the first time in years, Andrew didn't feel like someone rebuilding what he lost. He felt like someone finally stepping into something worth keeping. As autumn settled in, the colors of the city softened into amber and gold, and Andrew's life took on a new kind of structure, one he hadn't known he craved. The early mornings were no longer about conference calls and strategy meetings, but about packing lunches, helping Oliver into his little jacket, and making sure his shoes were on the correct feet. On weekdays, Andrew picked him up from preschool, sometimes taking him to the park, sometimes to the bookstore, where Oliver would run his hands along the shelves and proudly choose picture books far above his reading level. There was something sacred in those routines, something grounding. It wasn't glamorous, and that's what made it feel real. He had quietly moved into an apartment just 2 blocks from Alice's place, a decision that had felt at first like a practical step but quickly became much more. It allowed him to be part of Oliver's day-to-day life without disruption. He wasn't an occasional presence anymore. He was a constant. Oliver now expected him to be there, asked for him when he wasn't, and told stories at dinner about things they'd done together. Alice no longer seemed surprised by this. At first, she had been wary of how easily their son bonded with Andrew, but now, she watched the two of them together with something close to peace. There were still boundaries, though. Andrew and Alice lived separately, operated independently, and avoided conversations that veered too far into the past. But there was less tension now, less effort in simply being around each other. They could talk over coffee without suspicion, joke in front of Oliver without awkward pauses, and occasionally linger after bedtime in quiet companionship. One evening, as they worked on a preschool project involving glitter and glue, Alice glanced at Andrew and asked, not unkindly, "Do you ever miss your old life?" He looked at her, considering the question. "I thought I would," he said. "But no. Not like this." "You were good at it," she said. "I was successful," he replied. "But I don't think I was ever happy." Alice didn't respond right away. She focused on cutting a piece of blue construction paper into a clumsy star. Then she said softly, "Neither was I." It was moments like that which built something new between them, not romance, not quite yet, but trust. The kind that grows quietly, brick by brick, where something once burned down. That trust deepened the night Oliver got a fever. He cried through the night, his skin hot, his body restless. Alice called Andrew just after midnight, and he came immediately. Together they sat beside his bed, taking turns with cold cloths, reading to him when he could listen, holding him when he couldn't sleep. At one point, Andrew looked over and saw Alice, eyes red from exhaustion, brushing Oliver's hair gently off his forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." She looked at him, and instead of anger or pain, there was only weariness and something like understanding. "We're here now," she said. "That's what matters." By morning, Oliver's fever broke, and the three of them collapsed on the couch together in a tangle of blankets and relief. It was chaotic, unplanned, and strangely perfect. Alice fell asleep first, her head resting against Andrew's shoulder, and though he didn't dare move, something inside him finally settled. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. From that point on, things began to shift, not drastically, not with big declarations, but in small, quiet ways. Alice stopped setting limits on how often Andrew could stay. She invited him to join them for dinner without hesitation. He fixed the leaky sink in her kitchen and replaced the batteries in the smoke detector without being asked. She bought extra cereal he liked. One afternoon, Oliver looked up from his drawing and asked, "Why doesn't Daddy live with us?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Andrew opened his mouth to speak, but it was Alice who answered first. "Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure out where home really is." Oliver nodded as if that made perfect sense and returned to his drawing. Later that evening, Andrew stood in the doorway, watching Alice read to their son before bed. He felt something he hadn't dared let himself feel in years, hope. Not the kind rooted in fantasy or desperation, but the kind that grows slowly, watered by forgiveness, steadied by patience. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew this, he wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever again. The first snow of winter came early, blanketing the city in white and quieting everything under a soft hush. It was just days before Christmas, and the streets were lined with lights, trees and windows, and the smell of cinnamon and pine drifting from corner bakeries. Oliver was more excited than ever, waking up each morning asking if it was the real Christmas yet, and watching the sky for reindeer. Andrew had helped him hang decorations at both homes, but it was Alice's apartment that truly felt like the heart of it all, warm, full of laughter, and strung with mismatched ornaments made from popsicle sticks and glitter. On Christmas Eve, Alice surprised Andrew by inviting him to spend the evening with them. Not just to drop off presents or join for an hour, but to stay, to be part of it all. She didn't use big words or offer explanations. She simply said, "Oliver wants you here." And Andrew had nodded, not trusting himself to say more. They baked cookies that afternoon, flour dusting every surface and sticking to Oliver's cheeks like snow. Alice played old holiday records, humming softly as she stirred batter and handed out pieces of dough. Andrew watched her move through the kitchen, graceful even in the chaos, and felt that same quiet ache in his chest, the one that reminded him how much had been lost, and how much he had been given another chance to hold. That night, after dinner and stories, after Oliver had carefully placed a cookie and a note for Santa near the window, they tucked him into bed together. He was too excited to fall asleep, but they stayed anyway, sitting on either side of him until his eyes finally fluttered closed. Alice rose first and turned off the light, and Andrew followed her into the living room, where the glow of the tree lit the room in soft gold. There was silence between them for a few minutes, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Alice turned to him, her expression unreadable. "He wrote a letter to Santa this year," she said. "But he didn't let me read it. Said it was secret." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Did you find it?" She nodded, then reached behind one of the ornaments on the tree and pulled out a small folded paper. She handed it to him without saying anything more. He opened it slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and read the large, uneven letters, "Dear Santa, I love Mommy and Daddy. Can we all live in one house so I don't have to miss anybody anymore? I've been really good." Andrew didn't speak. He stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring slightly. When he looked up, Alice was watching him, not with pressure or expectation, but with something far more fragile, openness. She wasn't asking. She wasn't rushing. She was simply letting him feel it, letting the moment belong to him as much as her. "I don't want to miss anything else," he said finally. "Not a day. Not another year. If it's too soon, I'll wait. But I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped closer, gently took the note from his hands, and placed it back on the tree. Then she looked up at him and, for the first time since the day he lost her, smiled in a way that reached all the way to her eyes. That night, Andrew didn't leave. He stayed. Not just on the couch. Not just for the sake of a tradition or for Oliver's happiness. He stayed because something had shifted, not in some grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet rhythm of two people who had finally learned to forgive, to trust, and to choose each other again. In the morning, Oliver ran into their room shouting that Santa had come. He dove onto the bed, laughing, tugging at the blankets with tiny hands. Andrew and Alice opened their eyes at the same time, side by side, and looked at their son, their reason, their miracle, their second chance. Outside, the world was still dusted in snow, but inside, it was warm and filled with something rare and unshakable. They hadn't just found their way back. They had built something better than what had come before. Not perfect. Not simple. But real. And this time, they were holding on to it with everything they had. The ending of this story is quiet, but deeply powerful, because it doesn't chase perfection, it embraces truth. What makes it satisfying isn't a dramatic twist or a fairy tale reunion, but the slow, honest return of love built on vulnerability, patience, and change. Andrew's transformation isn't sudden. He doesn't fix everything overnight, nor is he instantly forgiven. Instead, he earns his way back, not with words, but through presence, consistency, and humility. Alice, too, shows immense strength, not just for surviving what she went through, but for allowing her heart to open again when she had every reason to guard it. And Oliver becomes the soul of the story, not because he asks for anything extraordinary, but because his simple desire, to have his parents close, reminds them of everything that truly matters. This ending works because it's rooted in reality. It doesn't pretend that pain disappears or that broken trust vanishes. Instead, it shows how people can grow through it. That healing is possible when both sides are brave enough to step back in, even after deep hurt. And that sometimes, the most unexpected second chances are the ones that finally bring you home. To me, that's the best kind of happy ending, earned, grounded, and full of quiet hope. The Millionaire CEO never made time for detours, until one small-town cafe, a little girl, and a face from his past stopped him cold. Michael Rivers had built his entire life around precision. Every minute of his day was accounted for, every decision carefully calculated, every move leading him closer to more power, more success. At 36, he was the CEO of one of the most profitable construction corporations in the country. His time was too valuable for detours, for spontaneous whims, for moments that didn't push him further ahead. That morning was supposed to be like every other, up before dawn, perfectly pressed suit, conference calls lined up before breakfast, a driver waiting promptly outside. He was on his way to an important meeting with potential investors, already running through his presentation in his mind, when his stomach unexpectedly twisted in hunger. The plan was to make it to the city without stopping, but when he saw a small roadside cafe up ahead, something impulsive overrode his schedule. It was a tiny place, almost invisible if not for the hand-painted sign and a few battered tables outside. Against every instinct, Michael told his driver to pull over. He needed coffee, maybe a quick bite, but more than that, he felt an odd tug in his chest he couldn't explain. The air was crisp as he stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel lot. The cafe looked like it had been there forever, a weathered building with chipped paint and flower boxes clinging stubbornly to life. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and coffee washed over him, grounding and oddly comforting. There weren't many customers, an old couple in the corner, a trucker sipping coffee at the counter, and a few empty booths. Michael barely had time to scan the room before he noticed her. A small girl, no older than 6 or 7, was weaving carefully between tables, balancing a tray almost too big for her tiny arms. She had long, straight blonde hair that shimmered in the morning light and bright green eyes that seemed almost too vivid for her delicate face. She wore a simple white apron over a faded dress, and though her movements were careful, he could see the natural clumsiness of a child doing a job much too big for her. She approached him with a shy, determined smile and held out a menu with her small hand. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, voice rehearsed but warm. For a moment, Michael couldn't find his voice. He stared at her, something tightening painfully in his chest without warning. Those green eyes, they were hauntingly familiar. As he took the menu, trying to gather his thoughts, his gaze drifted behind the counter, and that was when he saw her. The woman who had once been his whole world. Haley. She was older now, thinner, the lightness in her once carefree posture replaced by a quiet, tired strength. Her brown hair was pulled back loosely, and though exhaustion was written across her face, there was no mistaking her. She looked up and met his gaze, and in that second, the years between them collapsed. Michael froze. So did Haley. The world around them, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation, seemed to vanish. For a few heartbeats, there was only the two of them and the undeniable, shattering recognition in their eyes. Michael's heart pounded against his ribs, his mind scrambling to make sense of the sight before him. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. He hadn't heard from her. He had moved on, or so he thought. And yet, here she was. Working in a rundown cafe, raising a little girl who looked so much like her. A girl with green eyes, his eyes. Michael sat down in the nearest booth, not even registering what he was doing. His hands shook slightly as he placed the menu on the table, though he quickly hid them beneath it when he noticed. He tried to steady his breathing, to focus, to find logic in a situation that made none. Across the room, Haley handed a plate to the trucker at the counter, her movements mechanical, as if her mind were somewhere else. Maybe she was trying to pretend she hadn't seen him. Maybe she needed to gather her strength before coming over. He couldn't blame her. He didn't know what he would say either. The little girl came back with a glass of water, carefully setting it down in front of him with a sweet smile. Michael managed to thank her, his voice low and rough. She beamed at the praise, her face lighting up so much it almost hurt to look at her. She didn't seem afraid or wary. To her, he was just another customer. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, her name, her age, her favorite color, whether she liked pancakes or waffles better, whether she knew anything about the man who had unknowingly abandoned her before she was even born. But he said nothing. It wasn't his place. Not yet. Finally, Haley wiped her hands on a towel and walked over. She stood across from him, her shoulders tense, her eyes guarded. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a friendly greeting. She simply asked, "What can I get you?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a subtle tremor buried beneath professionalism. Michael stared at her for a second longer than he should have before clearing his throat. "Just coffee," he said. He hesitated. "And maybe a moment of your time when you're free." Haley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she gave a short nod and left. Michael watched her go, feeling 1,000 emotions churn inside him: regret, shame, anger at himself, confusion at how everything could feel so raw after so long. When the coffee arrived, he wrapped his hands around the mug just to keep himself grounded. The little girl stayed busy, wiping tables, bringing napkins to the few customers still lingering. She chatted politely with them, her bright spirit undeniable even in the modest surroundings. Michael caught himself smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. She was so full of life, so innocent to the hardships pressing down on her young shoulders. It was clear she wasn't just helping for fun. She was part of the running of this cafe, likely because Haley had no one else to rely on. And the realization sent a bolt of guilt through him so sharp it almost left him breathless. He didn't know what their story was, not really. But he knew enough. He knew that if she was his daughter, and every fiber of his being screamed that she was, he had missed 7 years of her life. First steps, first words, scraped knees, birthday candles. Lost not because fate had stolen them, but because he had chosen ambition over love all those years ago. When Haley finally returned, she sat down across from him without being asked, folding her hands carefully in her lap. She looked tired. Older. But still heartbreakingly beautiful. And still carrying so much strength. Michael put down his coffee, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "How old is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Haley exhaled slowly, her eyes softening but never losing their guardedness. 6.5, she said. The words hit him like a hammer. He did the math in his head without needing to. She had been pregnant when he left. She hadn't said a word. And he had been too blind to look back, too convinced that walking away was the smart thing, the necessary thing. "She's mine, isn't she?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Haley nodded once, a small, sad gesture. There were no accusations in her eyes. Only a quiet acceptance of what had been lost. Michael swallowed hard, his world shifting under him as he realized the depth of everything he had missed, and the even deeper truth that it might not be too late to be the man he should have been from the start. Michael sat frozen in his seat, gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had prepared himself for many negotiations, for boardroom battles with some of the fiercest minds in business, but nothing had prepared him for this conversation. Nothing could have prepared him for the simple, devastating truth sitting right in front of him. Haley watched him with an expression that was both gentle and firm, giving him space to process it all without pushing, without recrimination. It only made him feel the weight of his mistakes more sharply. He glanced over at the little girl, who was now giggling softly as she tried to balance 2 plastic cups on a tray twice her size. She was beautiful, radiant, full of a life he had never even glimpsed until this morning. There was no doubt anymore. She had his green eyes, his stubborn chin, the same slight dimple that only appeared when she smiled wide enough. And in that moment, Michael understood with absolute clarity that no business deal, no financial empire, no trophy of success could ever matter more than what he had already lost and what he still might save. When he turned back to Haley, his voice was quieter, more raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. He remembered who he had been back then, hungry for more, desperate to prove himself, blind to everything that didn't fit into the plan he had drawn for his life. Haley's hands twisted together in her lap before she spoke. "Because you made it very clear," she said, her tone gentle but unwavering. "You didn't want anything slowing you down. You had your path laid out, Michael. I didn't fit into it anymore. And I thought if I told you about her, you would have felt obligated. I didn't want our daughter to be someone's obligation. She deserved better than that. Her words hit harder than any accusation could have. He hadn't just walked away from Haley, he had unknowingly walked away from his own blood, from a life that might have grounded him, saved him from becoming so hollow inside. He felt the urge to apologize, but the words seemed too small for the damage that had been done. "I didn't know," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I know," Haley said softly. "But knowing now, what are you going to do?" The question hung between them like a heavy weight. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a door, cracked open, waiting to see if he had the courage to walk through it. Michael sat back, breathing slowly, thinking harder than he had in years. The easy choice would have been to walk away again, to tell himself it was too late, that the damage was irreparable. But looking at Haley, at the little girl stacking sugar packets into a tower at the next table, he knew he could never make that mistake again. "I want to know her," he said finally, the word steady, his decision absolute. "I want to be part of her life, if you'll let me. Both of your lives." Haley looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his. She didn't say anything right away, and he didn't rush her. He knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt in an instant. He had to earn it, day by day, word by word, action by action. Finally, she gave a small nod. Not a full agreement, not yet, but a beginning. Michael exhaled slowly, feeling something inside him begin to shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing after success. He was chasing after something real. Something that could never be measured in dollars or deals. And for the first time in his adult life, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The following days moved with a kind of strange slowness, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis and Michael was still learning how to walk on it. Every morning, he found himself pulling into the gravel parking lot of the little cafe without even thinking about it. His driver, at first confused, quickly learned not to question it. Michael no longer wore his suits and polished shoes here. Instead, he arrived in jeans and rolled-up sleeves, trying to shed the layers of his old life piece by piece. He would sit at the same corner table and wait for her, the little girl with his eyes, to bring him a menu she knew he didn't need anymore. At first, Sophie, as he had finally learned her name, treated him like any other customer, polite but distant. Haley remained cautious too, always keeping a watchful eye, never fully relaxing. But Michael did not push. He let the moments build themselves naturally. He helped when the cafe got busy, carrying plates, wiping tables, changing the light bulb that flickered near the counter. He stayed late enough to stack chairs and sweep the floor when Haley's exhaustion became too obvious to hide. It was small things that began to open the door between them. One afternoon, Sophie tripped over a loose mat and scraped her knee. Michael was the one who picked her up and carried her to a chair, his heart hammering with protective panic. He cleaned the wound gently while she sniffled, and he didn't let go until she smiled again. That night, Haley thanked him quietly as she locked the door behind the last customer, her voice softer, more real. Sometimes Sophie would sit with him during the slow hours, coloring pictures and explaining the rules of made-up games with deadly seriousness. She told him about her favorite animal, horses, her favorite ice cream, mint chocolate chip, and her dream of becoming a ballerina. Michael listened to every word like it was the most important business meeting of his life. He learned that Haley had kept the cafe after her parents passed away, struggling to make ends meet alone. He learned that there had been offers to buy the land, to turn it into a gas station or a mini-mart, but she had refused every time. This cafe wasn't just a business. It was a promise to herself that she could build something stable for her daughter with her own two hands, even if it meant constant worry, even if it meant exhaustion. Michael began to see the small cracks beneath Haley's strength, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the nights she stayed up balancing the cafe's books by hand, the deep sighs she let slip when she thought she was alone. He wanted to fix everything immediately, to throw money at the problem and make all the pain go away. But he knew that would only insult her. Haley didn't want a savior. She wanted someone who would stay. One evening, after closing, Haley handed him a mug of coffee and sat down across from him. The windows were dark, the tables wiped clean, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She studied him over the rim of her cup. "You're different now," she said finally, almost like an accusation but softer. "Not the man who left." Michael met her gaze without flinching. "I'm trying to be," he said. "I don't know if it's enough. But I know it has to be real." Haley looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the chipped edge. "She deserves someone real." "I know," he said. "So do you." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand declarations. Just two people sitting in the soft quiet of a battered cafe, slowly stitching together a fragile, necessary trust. Michael realized that night that change wasn't a single act or decision. It was 1,000 small choices, made over and over again, to stay when it would be easier to walk away. And he had never been more certain in his life that he would stay. As summer deepened, Michael's connection to the cafe and the small family within it grew stronger. The days no longer felt like interruptions to his real life, they felt like his life. Meetings were rescheduled or cancelled altogether, important calls were pushed to the margins of his calendar, and somehow the empire he had once believed needed his constant attention continued to function without his every breath. Each morning he drove himself instead of using a chauffeur, arriving at the cafe before the doors even opened, ready to help Haley set up tables, fill salt shakers, and brew the first pot of coffee. Sophie would run to greet him with an enthusiasm that squeezed his heart every time, her little arms wrapping tightly around his waist, her trust growing without demands or conditions. Michael learned the rhythms of the cafe as intimately as he once knew the rhythms of the stock market. He knew which regulars liked extra butter with their toast, which ones needed a quiet smile but not conversation. He learned how to make the coffee the exact way Haley liked it, strong but not bitter, with just a splash of milk. He learned Sophie's moods, when she needed laughter and when she needed someone simply to sit quietly and color beside her. Slowly, the walls between them all thinned until they barely existed. But it wasn't just the work or the routines that tethered him to this new life. It was the moments in between, the sight of Haley brushing a strand of hair behind her ear while taking an order, the feel of Sophie tugging his hand to show him a crayon masterpiece, the quiet smiles exchanged over tired but happy breakfasts after the rush of customers ended. These small, seemingly ordinary moments accumulated into something profound, something that made his former world of boardrooms and bonuses feel shallow by comparison. Despite the growing closeness, Michael knew better than to assume everything was forgiven. Haley was still guarded sometimes, especially when talk drifted too close to the future. She never asked for promises, never demanded plans, and Michael understood that after so much history between them, trust was something he had to earn slowly. Not with grand gestures, but with consistency, with showing up again and again, no matter how small the task. One afternoon, after the cafe had closed early due to a thunderstorm, they all sat together in the kitchen, playing a battered old board game Sophie had insisted on rescuing from the back storage room. The rain hammered against the windows, and the overhead lights flickered once or twice, but inside it was warm and bright. Sophie laughed every time Michael lost a turn, her joy so infectious that even Haley laughed openly, without hesitation. It was during one of those easy, laughter-filled moments that Sophie asked the question Michael had both feared and longed to hear. "Mr. Mike," she said, leaning over the board with wide, serious eyes, "are you gonna be my dad one day?" The room seemed to still, the hum of the refrigerator, the patter of rain, everything dropping away into silence. Michael felt Haley's eyes on him, felt the weight of everything in the world settle onto his shoulders. He looked at Sophie, her innocent face full of hope, and then at Haley, whose expression was unreadable but whose eyes shone with unshed tears. Michael didn't rush his answer. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table so he was at Sophie's level, and spoke with quiet honesty. "I would love nothing more," he said. "But it's a big decision, sweetheart. It's something your mom and I have to talk about and work through, so we can do it right. Because you deserve it to be right." Sophie nodded solemnly, seeming satisfied, and went back to her game. Haley remained silent, but when Michael dared to glance at her again, she gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of approval. A beginning. A fragile, precious beginning. That night, after Sophie was asleep in the small room above the cafe, Michael and Haley sat outside on the back steps, a thin mist still hanging in the air after the storm. They didn't speak for a long time. They simply existed side by side, breathing the same cool night air, watching the stars blink uncertainly through the cloud cover. Finally, Haley broke the silence. "You really meant it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Michael turned his head to look at her, no hesitation in his voice. "With everything I have," he said. And for the first time, Haley leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, letting him carry some of the weight she had held alone for far too long. Summer slowly faded into the first crisp days of autumn, and with it came a new kind of settling, one that Michael had never experienced before. The chaos of city life, the endless chase for more, the cold luxury he had once wrapped himself in, all of it felt so distant now, almost like a life he had watched someone else live. The cafe had become more than just a place he visited, it was home in every way that mattered. Haley had opened a space for him in their lives, not with grand gestures or emotional declarations, but with simple, daily trust, the kind that was earned, not given freely. Sophie now ran to him without hesitation, her arms flung wide every time she saw him, her giggles lighting up the entire room. She began calling him Dad, sometimes without even realizing it, slipping the word into casual conversations, as natural as breathing. The first time it happened, she was coloring a picture of their little cafe family and simply said, "This one's you, Daddy," without looking up. Michael's heart had clenched so hard it had been difficult to breathe, but he had managed to smile and nod, his voice steady even though everything inside him trembled with emotion. Haley saw it too. She saw the way Sophie had stitched Michael into the fabric of their lives as if he had always been there, and though it scared her, it also softened her. Their conversations grew deeper, quieter, filled with the kind of openness that only comes from shared vulnerability. They spoke about the hard years Haley had survived alone, the nights she stayed up worrying how she would pay the bills, the mornings she cried in the shower so Sophie wouldn't hear. Michael listened, every word cutting deeper into the old wounds he carried, but he never once interrupted or tried to make excuses. He knew silence could be an apology too, if it was filled with understanding and not pride. Sometimes after Sophie went to bed, they sat together in the cafe's small back office, sorting through paperwork or sipping coffee in comfortable quiet. Other nights, they simply leaned against the counter and talked about nothing at all, about books they never finished reading, about places they once dreamed of visiting, about silly things Sophie had said during the day. These moments were ordinary on the surface but sacred underneath, stitching together the rift between them with careful, invisible threads. As the season changed, Michael made small changes of his own. He officially stepped back from his role as CEO, moving into a chairman position that required far less of his daily attention. The board was stunned, but he didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't chasing more. He was protecting what he had found. He didn't announce it to Haley, didn't present it like a grand sacrifice. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about making space, clearing a life cluttered with noise to make room for something real. One particularly cold evening, Haley surprised him by asking if he wanted to help redecorate the cafe for the fall festival the town hosted every year. He said yes immediately, even before she finished the question. They spent the afternoon untangling strings of orange lights, hanging paper leaves from the ceiling, and arranging pumpkins Sophie had painted with messy, colorful faces. It was the kind of day that was sticky with laughter and small frustrations, the kind of day that mattered more than all the important meetings he had ever attended combined. When the decorating was finished and the cafe glowed warmly against the early dusk, Haley stood beside him, arms crossed, surveying their work. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Thank you for not giving up this time." Michael didn't answer with words. He reached over and laced his fingers with hers, a simple, steady promise. And this time, he meant it with every beat of his heart. The morning of the town's fall festival arrived with a bright, cold breeze that carried the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Michael woke up early, earlier even than Sophie, and for a long time he just lay there in the guest room above the cafe, listening to the quiet hum of the small building he had come to love more than any skyscraper he had ever worked in. The sun rose slowly, spilling gold across the wooden floor, and with it came a sense of peace, steady and real, the kind he had spent his whole life chasing in all the wrong places. Downstairs, the cafe was already buzzing with life. Haley was tying orange and gold ribbons around the chairs, her hair pulled into a loose braid, a few strands falling around her face. Sophie was running from table to table, making sure each pumpkin she had decorated was perfectly placed, her cheeks flushed pink with excitement. Michael joined them quietly, slipping into the rhythm without needing to be asked. They were a team now, moving together, laughing softly at little mistakes, their movements easy and sure. As customers began to trickle in, the small cafe transformed into a hub of laughter and music, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and baking bread. Michael manned the small cider stand Haley had set up outside, serving steaming mugs to townspeople who greeted him like he had always been part of the community. No one treated him like a millionaire or a CEO. They treated him like Michael, the man who helped clean tables, who repaired the broken chair last week, who stood in the cold smiling because he wanted to, not because he needed to impress anyone. In the middle of the afternoon, while Haley was inside handling a rush of customers, Sophie tugged at Michael's hand and pulled him toward the little stage set up near the fountain. A group of children were gathering there, preparing for a small talent show. Sophie, cheeks pink with nervous energy, whispered that she had signed up to sing. Michael knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and told her that no matter what happened, he was proud of her. Her eyes lit up with that pure, fierce happiness only a child can show, and she threw her arms around his neck before running off to take her place in line. Michael found Haley just as the first performers started, and they stood together at the edge of the crowd. The small stage was framed by trees just starting to turn amber and red, and in the center of it all was Sophie, clutching a small microphone with both hands. When the music started, her voice was small and shaky at first, but as she found the melody, it grew stronger. She sang about family and belonging, about finding your place, about holding on when the world feels too big. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was filled with so much heart that Michael felt something crack open deep inside him. He looked at Haley and found tears shining in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. She laced her fingers through his, squeezing tightly as if she needed him as much as he needed her. In that moment, it didn't matter what had come before. The missed years, the pain, the choices they wished they could take back, all of it was part of the path that had led them here, standing together under a sky heavy with autumn light, watching their daughter sing the story of their new life. When Sophie finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and she beamed, her whole face glowing. She jumped off the stage and ran straight into Michael's arms, nearly knocking him over with the force of her hug. He lifted her high into the air, laughing, and when he set her down, she grabbed Haley's hand too, pulling them both close. They stood there for a long time, the three of them tangled together, and for the first time in his life, Michael understood that real success had nothing to do with money or titles. It was right here, in the small arms wrapped around his neck, in the tired but radiant smile on Haley's face, in the weightless feeling of knowing he had finally made it home. The first frost came early that year, covering the grass and rooftops in a thin layer of white that shimmered in the morning sun. Michael woke up with Sophie curled against him on the couch, a forgotten picture book still open on his lap. Haley was asleep in the armchair nearby, her head resting against the back of the seat, her legs tucked underneath her for warmth. The cafe had closed early the night before, giving them a rare evening to just exist without customers or obligations, and somehow the quiet moments had stretched into sleep without anyone even realizing it. Michael stayed still for a moment, breathing in the soft, steady rhythm of his daughter's sleep, feeling a kind of contentment he had never known before. He eased himself up carefully, carrying Sophie to her small bed upstairs, tucking her in with the practiced care that had become second nature. When he returned to the living room, Haley was awake, blinking sleepily at him. She smiled, slow and genuine, the kind of smile that felt like it belonged only to him. He crossed the room and sat down beside her, taking her hand without a word. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the creaks of the old building settling around them, the whisper of the wind outside, the beating of hearts that no longer raced out of fear or doubt but moved steadily forward together. Later that morning, Michael drove them into town for breakfast at the small diner they had started frequenting on Sundays. Sophie chattered in the back seat, recounting every tiny detail of her school week with the breathless enthusiasm of a child who trusted completely that she was being heard. Michael listened to every word, laughing when she made jokes, asking questions when she got too excited and jumbled her stories. Haley watched him with a soft expression that spoke volumes about how far they had all come. At the diner, the waitress knew them by name now, bringing Sophie's favorite chocolate milk without being asked and slipping an extra packet of crayons onto the table. Michael looked around at the small-town life he once would have scorned for being too slow, too simple, and realized he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Not even the billions he once chased with every waking breath. After breakfast, they walked down Main Street, visiting the tiny bookstore where Sophie picked out a fairy tale collection, and then the craft shop where Haley chose new paints for her art projects. Michael bought a battered old chess set from a second-hand store, deciding he would teach Sophie how to play on cold winter nights. They ended the morning at the town square, where a few vendors had set up stalls selling handmade candles, knitted scarves, and jars of local honey. Michael bought a jar for the cafe without thinking twice, laughing when Sophie insisted on trying a sample from every booth. As they walked back to the car, Sophie skipped ahead, twirling with the boundless energy only children seem to have. Michael slowed his pace and reached for Haley's hand. She intertwined her fingers with his easily, naturally, as if she had been waiting for him to do it all along. "I'm scared sometimes," Haley said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. "That this could fall apart. That you'll wake up one day and realize you want something else again." Michael stopped walking, pulling her gently to a halt with him. He turned her to face him, brushing a strand of hair away from her eyes. "There's nothing else I want," he said with quiet certainty. "There's nothing else I'll ever want again." Tears welled in Haley's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, smiling instead, a little shy, a little amazed. Michael leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a tender promise written in every movement. When they reached the car, Sophie was waiting, bouncing on her toes, her arms full of treasures she had collected along the way. She grinned up at them, completely secure in the knowledge that they would always come back to her, that they were hers as much as she was theirs. Michael opened the car door and helped her climb inside, fastening her seatbelt with a care that was second nature now. As he turned back to Haley, he realized that what they had built, piece by fragile piece, was stronger than anything he had ever created with concrete or steel. It was love that didn't shout but endured. It was family, unexpected and imperfect and absolutely perfect in its own way. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the car, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't see the cold, driven CEO he used to be. He saw a man who had nearly lost everything without ever knowing it, and who had somehow been given the extraordinary chance to find it again. He smiled and drove them home. What I love most about the ending of this story is how deeply earned it feels. It's not about dramatic gestures or sweeping promises, it's about quiet choices made every single day, about building something real from broken pieces. Michael's journey shows that true success isn't measured in wealth or status, but in the relationships we nurture, the forgiveness we ask for, and the love we are brave enough to fight for. The ending feels powerful because it reflects life honestly, imperfect, slow, and sometimes scary, but full of second chances if we're willing to reach for them. Michael, Haley, and Sophie don't find a perfect fairy tale. They find something better, family, built on trust, resilience, and everyday love. In my view, it's the kind of happy ending that matters most, because it's the kind that could happen in real life, and that makes it unforgettable.